When was the last time you phoned a travel agent to discuss available flights and times when booking a trip? Well, likely you can't remember if you're part of the 70% of Americans who prefer to book trips and other events online and on their own time. So why aren't your patients given that same convenient option? Today, airlines are filling once empty seats on planes because their customers can easily see what flights the airline wants to make available. And with a click of a mouse, customers can schedule themselves. So again, why aren't you filling your empty seats during the day the same way airlines are? Likely your answer is because you don't know how. Well, what if it was as easy as your website guru simply copying some code, pasting it, and like magic, a scheduling widget appears on your website? Meet ScheduleWidget.com. It's easy, it's free, and you could be allowing new patients to book their own appointments today. With ScheduleWidget.com, your website becomes a super highway of new patients who can view available appointments and book their own appointments. ScheduleWidget.com also allows third parties to push new patients to your practice. It all takes less than 90 seconds to sign up. So what are you waiting for? See what ScheduleWidget.com can do for your practice today. Visit ScheduleWidget.com to sign up or request more information.